Well, thank you, everyone. It's so nice to be here. Feel very honored to be asked to come and talk about a subject that I've really come to use and admire, and is really ingrained in a lot of what I'm doing in symmetry. People love patterns. Uh, it is satisfying to identify the next item in a sequence or to be able to predict the future. It's helpful when we're planning, and we feel stable and secure when we're able to do this. We also enjoy the unexpected, and we like it when the pattern shifts beneath and we see things from a new angle. And it's this tension that I love to explore. It's this tension that really sort of stimulates our senses. Um, in the world around us, in the visual arts, a classic kind of pattern is symmetry. And symmetry is an ordering principle. We say that something is symmetrical when, although it is transformed in some way, it still remains the same. Our own bodies are symmetrical. And like this orchid, if you split it down the center in the y-axis and flip it over, you will get pretty much the same thing. We call this reflective symmetry. There's been studies done and shown that people, humans, prefer faces that are more symmetrical than other faces. Rotational symmetry is when a design or a form is rotated around a central point, like this starfish or petals on a flower. We also call this radial symmetry. Another kind of symmetry is translational symmetry, where a design is shifted and rotated or repeated, like this mosaic. You can also find this in wallpaper or in honeycombs. So there's many ways to talk about symmetry that I'm not going to even get to today. What I'm really focusing today on is how radial symmetry in particular has been influential in my work and still continues to be. The artwork that I produce today is really largely shaped by my childhood experiences and relationships. And as a young child, I was obsessed with butterflies and moths, like this Cecropia moth here, which is really about the size of these note cards here, and as a child seemed even larger. So I would pore for hours over encyclopedias and field guides and studying the colors and the variety and the textures and all the various combinations. And I started to collect butterflies and moths. And I would find caterpillars and I'd give them the right food and watch them go through the whole transformation and metamorphosis process. I could even be found in parking lots peeling off the wings of the smashed butterflies from the cars, stuff in my pocket to look at later at the table. I became particularly entranced with the monarch butterfly for just its almost impossible aspects. Here's a caterpillar that consumes the milkweed plant, which has a toxin. It doesn't harm that caterpillar, but if a predator comes along and eats it, it will the caterpillar will become distasteful to the predator. Also, equally as fascinating to me is just amazing still is the monarch's migration. So every winter, millions of monarchs find their way to a certain specific forests in Mexico. And they've never been there before. Their parents weren't there before. It was their grandparents or even their great-grandparents that were there. And we don't really fully understand how they know how to find these places. If you capture a monarch in Virginia during the migration and you fly it across the country and release it, it will find its way to those forests. And that's just fascinating. This, by the way, is a drawing I did when I was 4.5. Really fascinated with monarchs and black swallowtails here. So these childhood interests have persisted into my adulthood, but it took a change in my approach to making art that the connection really became more apparent to me. And up until this time, up until this change, my approach to making art was really random. I would bring materials together and just to see what would bubble up, to see what was unconscious. It wasn't until I started working with a mentor that I decided to intentionally set a course in my work. And I did this series on compulsion and desire, and using the monarch's instinct to migrate as a metaphor for my own compulsions. Also exploring ideas of metamorphosis as well as hatching and release. So working in a series really suited me. I liked this. I liked sort of being set on this course. And I decided to use this manner in another series I called Hybrids. And in this series, I began to do some portraiture, people that I know, and really surrealist portraiture, where I combined physical traits of people that I know with the physical traits of plants, and really answering the question, if you were a plant, what plant would you be? And I started to experiment with heat transfer process where I would combine this, print it out on the film, cut out the actual pieces that I want, then iron them on to pieces of paper that had been treated with pastel and tempera paint, and then I would hand paint around them the far distant vistas. I started to notice these really kind of looked like stickers, and I wanted them to be fully integrated into the piece. So I began to look more at the color combinations and refining that. And then I also started looking into art history to bring in some elements there. So if you notice in this picture of the Virginia creeper, on the left is a castle, and in the middle is a tree line, and on the right is this little village. And this is from actually a Renaissance painting by Titian of Sacred and Profane Love. So after I kind of exhausted my immediate circle of friends, I started looking into art history again and finding my art history friends. Here we have David Hockney's Mr. and Mrs. Clark and Percy, the cat, and my version, again, still trying to blend and confuse what is painted and what is heat transfer. So right about this time, I had an encounter that was incredibly significant to me. And I was visiting the Bargello, which is a sculpture museum in Florence, Italy. And I came across this piece. This is The Loves of Jupiter, and it's by Alessandro Allori. It's actually painted as a headboard. It's painted in 1572. And at first, I was captivated by the combination of the real and the surreal, the colors and the details, these fantastical creatures, but ultimately this symmetrical design. And after being pulled in, after being pulled in by the visual aspects of this piece, I started to have these feelings, these arise, and I've never felt anything quite like this since or before. It was like this boundless and infinite union with something larger than me, like I had stepped into a stream of sort of infinite present moments. Like the artist was speaking directly to my soul, and I had a direct connection with this. And I really understood that these artifacts have a life beyond a human life, and were very powerful, all through this visual language, which includes symmetry. And although it was temporary, it was a real visceral experience. And then I began to see this style everywhere. They were on the walls of palaces and the ceilings of palaces, along the windows, on frames within Renaissance painting that I was looking at, and I needed to know more. I learned that this style really originated from ancient Roman wall painting, 2,000 years old. The Romans would paint the inside of their buildings without windows, and they would paint this illusionistic style, often with elements of architecture and sometimes little vignettes. interlaced garlands and vines, statuary, and a little sort of whimsical things. And sometimes the architecture would not be even something that could really hold up an entablature, or they were simply used to delineate the symmetrical design. During the Renaissance, this particular style was rediscovered, and artists such as Raphael and Michelangelo and Pinturicchio, who painted this. This is the ceiling of a little library off the Siena Cathedral. They were sometimes lowered down into these ruins that were often underground, and they called these places grottos, and thus the style is called grotesques today. And so, like Pinturicchio, I wanted to try my hand at this style. And so this is one of the first ones that I did. And each one of these features a symmetrical design. Often it has also the heat transfer as well as hand-painted elements. And usually a central architectural element. And then also a portrait that was placed purposefully in the middle to engage the viewer. I really wanted to connect like I felt that connection in the Bargello. I started a subsequent series after this of 15 pieces, and each of these pieces was really about a particular quality or an attribute that I hope to nurture within myself, like confidence or fortitude or authenticity. And each of these pieces is the same size, 18 by 22. They're on paper. I started to work all the way out to the borders instead of leaving that border of temper paint around it. The first ones included the heat transfer pieces, but eventually I did away with those, realizing that I enjoyed just painting. This particular piece is about stage fright because I really have a lot of nerve standing up in front of people. And each one of these also had a dominant color scheme that really was like a tone poem. And when I would go into my studio, these would become a meditative process. And really, ultimately, the series is about internal strength and balance. So I continue to investigate sort of the wonder of looking and the natural world. And as I do this, symmetry has really become ingrained in everything that I do. This is a monarch that hatched at my house in September, and I was just in the right place at the right time and was able to capture it and have been using it in this is one of my latest paintings. It's not quite finished. I'm looking for an eye model if anybody's interested. So that's all I have to share with you today. I really appreciate the opportunity and for your attention. And if you have any questions, let me know. Yes, so the question is, am I drawing everything out on a grid? I am. I wasn't at the beginning when I was first doing this, but I really wanted to find some things that were truly symmetrical. But yes. Yeah. So the question is, how long does it take to create one of these? It takes me a long time. My days are filled with working in the schools, but I do keep a studio practice. I use a very small brush because it's comforting to me. But I think of my studio practice as like a yoga practice, where I go to keep up my skills, also to investigate things intellectually for my mental well-being. So it's a regular practice. I worked larger than I've ever have last year on a large painting and just finished that in September. This last piece that you just saw is about 2 feet by 2 feet, and I'm just wrapping it up now. So a little bit of both. She's asking about what is the process. The images sometimes seem random. A lot of these I lift from my travels. I'm a gardener, I'm outside. I love natural history. So when I see things, I snap them and then I I do. There are some things that I know exactly. I'm gonna be putting this in a painting, so there's a stash of those images. A lot of it is related to my travel. I like to travel, I like to go to art museums and see things, and I am continually inspired by ancient and Renaissance grotesque paintings. So a lot of them are looking back at that tradition. So she's asking what goes into choosing the structure. Some of them I just made up at the beginning, and some of them are direct quotes from the ornaments. I have a book on ornamental design, and they feature paintings by Raphael. I also have a book on architecture, classical architecture, and another book on Baroque architectural elements. And so sometimes I'll use those as references. How do I feel about asymmetry? I'm fine with asymmetry. I'm fine. Um, in most of my pieces, most of it is symmetrical, but the people are not, and they're kind of just coming up to, or just coming up to that architectural element. At first, they were dead on, which I also like, but I think there's a little bit more tension in that sort of combination of a piece that mostly has a symmetrical structure. So the question is about keeping a regular practice, and advice that I'd give to anyone. I give this advice to my students often, is that any little bit is a good bit, and that if you can find somebody to be accountable to, that would be really great. If you have a group of people that you can meet up and share, that's helpful in a lot of ways. Not only does it light a fire under you to make things, but it also gives you somebody to talk to and hear how they respond to the pieces. Yeah. Okay, so how do I find my practice influencing my work in the schools? Well, as a teacher, when I was in the classroom, I think it's just really important for the teacher to be making things, so that you understand the struggle. Being creative, making things is a struggle. And usually you bump up against things that are stumbling blocks. So knowing how to talk to your students about that, and be honest with that, I think is powerful for them. Also, when I was in the classroom, I would often bring in these pieces, and I would show the students and get feedback, because they're completely honest with you. They do not hold back about what needs to be in some of those images. Yep. Is there an opportunity to see them? You can give me a call and I'll show you them. They're in my studio. A lot of them, some of them are in homes. I'm working, like I said, I have 2 new pieces. They took this year to make them. One of them is not even finished. So I want to build up a body of work before I kind of put them out again. But yes, I would love anybody who's interested to see them to let me know. I'm happy to show you. Oh. I think the question is, do I digitally flip the images? I use an app called Instamirror for my photography, and that's really helpful. I've been playing with that a lot in order to like take an image and make go through several iterations just to see what comes up, and then some of those, like this last one here, came from that process. But typically I'll use that photo and then I'll put it over a grid and I'll hand draw it. And sometimes I really am eager to see what it's going to look like. So if I just have done the one side, I'll use that app again to see what's going on the other side.
Thank you so much. Give it up for Aaron.